Hello guys, today we are going to look at Leetcode number 2239. The question states find closest number to 0. How are we going to solve this problem? Well, let's first read the problem statement. It says, given an integer array nums of size n, return the number with the value closest to 0 in nums. If there are multiple answers, return the number with the largest value. So what do we mean by this? Well, let us try and break the question down so that we can understand it better. First of all, in the first sentence, it says, given an integer array nums of size n, return the number with the value closest to 0. So for instance, let's say we have our number line over here, right? And let's say the number that we are getting over here is the number that is coming from the array. And let's say this one is 0, right? But we have 1 here, we have 5 here, we have 6 here, we have minus 1 here, we have minus 5 here, and we have minus 11 here, right? If you take a look at the question, it says, given an integer array nums of size n, return the number with the value closest to 0. So for instance, let's say picking this as our array, right? We can have an array of, let's say, something like, now this is our array, right? And this is how we have plotted the array on a number line, right? So the question is, first of all, you need to ask yourself, which one of these numbers that you have plotted on the number line is closer to 0? It is clear, right? 1 over here is closer to 0. So for this, the answer of this will definitely be 1. Because when you take a look at the question again, it says, if there are multiple answers, return the number with the largest value. So there are multiple answers which are closer to 0. We have things like minus 1 and 1. They are both closer to 0. But as the question says, return the number which has the greater value. So definitely it is going to be this one over here, right? In the first example, it says we have an array of minus 4, minus 2, 1, 4, and 8, right? So let me copy this array. Now this is our array, right? So we have minus 4, minus 2, 1, 4, and 8. So this is what we are going to do. First of all, right, we need to loop over our array. So on the first iteration, well, as you can see, minus 4 at this instance, or in the first iteration of our array, minus 4 is the number which is closer to 0. So first of all, we say we have minus 4, right, which is closer to 0. Now in the second iteration, right, so when you see red colors, the red color stands for iterations, right? So in the second iteration, you ask yourself, is minus 2 closer to 0 than minus 4? Definitely minus 2 is closer to 0 than minus 4, right? So our number closer to 0 will become what? Will become minus 2. So let us remove this. Now we write minus 2 for here, right? Now in the third iteration over here, right, inside our for loop, you ask ourselves, is 1 closer to 0 than minus 2? Definitely on a number line, right, 1 is closer to 0 than minus 2. So what are we going to do? We're just going to erase this minus 2 over here, right, and just write 1 over here. Or since because 1 is a number closer to 0 than minus 2, right? Now in the fourth iteration, this is what you ask yourself, right? In the fourth iteration, you ask yourself, is the number 4 over here bigger than, or is the number 4 over here closer to 0, or 1 is closer to 0? Definitely 1 over here is closer to 0 than this 4 over here. So we maintain the 1 over here. Now ask yourself, in the fifth iteration, is 8 bigger than, is 8 closer to 0? Sorry, slip of tongue. Is 8 closer to 0, or 1 is still closer to 0? It is definitely 1. So still 1 is still closer to 0, right? I hope you are getting the gist of what you are doing over here. So basically what you are doing is, we are just running a for loop through the array, right? And we are comparing the value that we have, right, or the current value that is closer to 0 to the current iteration value. So since as we started, right, we had -4, which was at that time closer to 0 in the first iteration. But as we moved on, we saw that it changed to become this one over here. But as time went by, even in the fourth iteration and in the fifth iteration, the one didn't change because it was still closer to 0. Now let us look at the second Leetcode example. So over here, we have input nums 2, -1, and 1, right? And we have the output is 1, right? So let us copy this one too, and with that same mentality, let's go over, right? In this case, right, we need to bring something we call the absolute values. What are absolute values? In mathematics, absolute values, for instance, a negative value is absolute value is positive value. For example, when we have -1, its absolute value or its ABS value is what we call 1, the positive integer. When you have -25, its ABS value is 25, the positive integer, right? Why are we bringing absolutes in this case? Let me show you something over here. Take a look at this chart over here. You see, when they were explaining this, they were saying that the distance from -4 to 0 is what? 4. The distance from -2 to 0 is 2. We all agree on that, right? The distance from 1 to 0 is 1. The distance from 4 to 0 is 4. And the distance from 8 to 0 is 8. What do you see over here? Or what sticks out to you over here? You can clearly see that even if a number is negative, right, they are using its absolute value to determine the distance between a point and an integer. So basically, if we will know the correct distance between an integer and 0, we need to use its absolute value or its positive absolute value. So for absolute values, we are going to say that if a number is negative, as the pattern over here says, if a number is negative, simply turn it into a positive integer, right, and calculate the distance, right? So if you get two numbers which are of the same absolute values, now you need to check which one is lesser than the other. So how are we going to do that? So basically, let us run through this code and see. In the first iteration, which is 2, right, basically the number which is closer to 0 will be what? Will be 2. I believe this one is clear, right? So in the first iteration, the number which is closer to 0 will be 2. Now in the second iteration that we have, right, we will get -1 as our value that we are going over. Now you ask yourself, what is the absolute value of -1? Definitely it is 1, right? The absolute value of -1 is 1, right? So 1 and 2, which one is closer to 0? It is clear. 1 is closer to 0, right? So we just write 1 here. 1 is closer to 0, right? So let me just change the color a bit. 1 is closer to 0. Now, on our third iteration, this is where we would ask ourselves, right? 1 and, sorry, my bad, we need to write -1 over here, not just 1. We need to write -1 over here, not just 1, right? So we will ask ourselves, 1 and -1, which one is closer to 0? Definitely, we know that the absolute value of -1 is what? Is 1. So the absolute value of 1 is also what? Is also 1. So basically, the absolute value are the same. But what differs is their cardinality. One is larger than the other, right? So as the question said, over here it says, if there are multiple answers, return a number with the largest value. So basically, the number with the largest value will be 1 over here. So we'll just erase this, right? We'll just write 1 over here. Now let's talk more code. Let's go into code. How are we going to solve this? This is how I like to solve mine. First of all, I like to initialize a variable. So I'll call it closest, right? Closest. And I'll initialize it to infinity. By the way, I'm using Typescript, but you can choose to use any language that you want. So let closest is equal to what? Infinity, right? Now over here, this is where we are going to run our for loop. So basically, we do something like for. You can use a for each loop or a for in loop if you like, but I prefer using a for loop. So let I is equal to 0, right? Let I is equal to 0. Then we do something like I is less than nums dot length. Length, right? Like a typical African. Length. I plus plus, right? Now let us open our bracket. Now over here, what are we going to do over here? Basically, we are going to get the absolute value of the number that we are currently iterating over. So if you are currently iterating over, say, something like -4, right? The absolute value of -4 is 4. Right, so how are we going to do that in JavaScript? Basically, we can use something like const distance is equals to mass.abs, right? Mass.abs into bracket nums I, the current iterating value that we are iterating over, right? So this one will give us the absolute value of each number, either positive or negative. If it is a positive integer, it is remained. If it is a negative integer, it is converted into a positive integer, as we can see over here, right? Now, what are we going to do again? Right now, we know our distance, right? That we are distance to 0, right? So, for instance, over here, when in the first iteration, our distance to 0 is 4 steps to 0, right? In the second iteration, our distance to 0 will be what? Our distance to 0 will be 2 steps to 0, right? Now, this is where we are going to ask ourselves. First of all, let's write our if statement. This is where the questions will come in. So first of all, we need to ask ourselves, is the distance that we have right now less than the closest value that we have? So basically, we write something like, is the distance less than the closest value that we have, the closest value that we are currently storing? So if the distance is less than the closest value that you are currently storing, it means that the closest value needs to be the number that you are currently iterating over. What do we mean by this? Let's see. For instance, right, in this array over here, let me just do something like this. In this array over here, right, let's say you know that we initialized our value, or we initialized our value, as you can see here, to infinity before we started the array. We started the array, right? So let's say we have something like infinity, right, over here. Now the absolute value of -4 is 4, right? So we will ask ourselves, is 4 less than infinity, right? So is 4 less than infinity? Definitely 4 is less than infinity. So right now our closest value will become what? Our closest value will become what we call 4, right? Now on the second iteration, our absolute value here is 2, right? Sorry, my bad. Our closest value will become what we call -4, not 4, right? Now to find the distance between -2 and 0, the absolute value of -2 is 2. Now this is where things get interesting, right? Now for the closest value, we also need to find its absolute value, say 4, right? Now you ask yourself, 4 and 2, which one is closer to 0? Definitely 2 is closer to 0. So right now our main closest value to 0 is what we call 2. I believe it's getting clearer now. So over here, we are checking if the distance or our absolute value is closer to 0 or is less than our closest value. If it is less than our closest value, it means that basically that number is closer to 0. Remember, we're not dealing, when we talk about absolute integers, right, or positive absolute integers, we are not dealing with negative integers. It's that from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to infinity, right? So on a number line, this is how it's going to be. Remember, we are dealing with absolute values, so no 0 or no negative number will come inside. That's the beauty of this approach, right? So basically, when you find the absolute value, say over here, the absolute value was 4, right? You compare it against infinity, right? Now you can see that 4 is less than infinity. So you choose that one as your closest value. Now when you go to negative 2, the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. So it is still closer to 0, or it is less than 4. So basically, you choose that over 4. I hope it is clear now, right? So basically, inside our if statement, right, we still need to find the absolute value of our closest value in order to determine that the distance is less than the distance that we have right now, the current iterations distance from 0 or to 0 is less than the closest value. So basically we do something like mass dot abs, right, mass dot absolute into brackets, then we pass in our closest value, closest, right, closest. Nice. Now, before we tackle this side, right, let us first finish this part. Then we'll go and tackle the if there are multiple answers, return the number with the largest value. So basically, what I'm going to do over here. So if the distance or the absolute value of the current iteration that we are on, say -4, -2, or even 8, is less than the closest value that we have over here, basically we are telling the program that now reassign the closest value to the current distance that is closer to 0. I hope it is clear now. Now over here, right, outside our for loop, we just need to return the closest, because as the question says, return a number with the value closest to 0, right? So let us run this and see. Well, it seems we made a mistake. Hey, infinity. My bad. So over here too, we also made a mistake over here, right? So let's do something like maths dot. Nice. Now let's see. So as you can see, our case 1 passed perfectly. Now let's tackle this part of the question. If there are multiple answers, return a number with the largest value. So let's say, for instance, right, you get over here, right, you get a number which is closer, or the absolute value of this is 1, and the absolute value of this is also what? Is also 1. So basically, they both have this same absolute numbers, right? So they are both equal, or the distance from -1 and 1 to 0, as we said over here, the absolute value of -1 is 1. So basically it's just one step, right? Now the distance from the positive integer 1 to 0 is also one step like this. Now how do we find the bigger number and return it? Basically we can do something like, we can bring an or over here, right? So we can do something like, or if the distance is equals to mass dot absolute into bracket closest, right? So if they are of the same value, right, as we saw over here, as we just saw over here, where the absolute value of this minus 1 and this one are the same value, basically what we are going to do is, if they are of the same value, we are going to write an end here, right? So if they are of the same value and at the same time, right, if they are of the same value and at the same time, if nums, or the current iteration that we are going over, right, is greater than closest, remember the value that we have stored, right? If that nums I is greater than closest, it means that we need to choose nums I over closest. Why are we saying this? Check something over here. So right now we've gotten the first part of our argument to pass, right? This part of our argument to pass. We when we reach the third iteration of this, we can see that the closest value, which is -1, is absolute value, and the iteration where we free the third iteration's value is absolute value, which is 1, are the same. So, right, so this condition is fulfilled. But let's check this end here. So if this one is true, this one must be true before this one will run, right? So first of all, let me just put this one inside the bracket before. So it's either this or these statements, right? So nice. Now let me format this. Nice. Now this first part of our argument has run, right? And let me say it is true. The distance and the absolute value, right, of the current iterator that we are on, or the closest value, is true, right? Now check over here. If they are true, right, it means that either one is a negative integer and one is a positive integer. If they are of the same values, let's say 1 and 1, we just move ahead, because this statement over here states that nums I is greater, if nums I is greater than the closest, then choose nums I and replace closest. So basically, using that same logic and we applying it over here, right, nums I in the third iteration will be 1, right? So in nums I in the third iteration will be 1, right? And the closest value is -1. Now the statement states that if nums I here is greater than -1 that we have as our closest value, then choose nums I over, or the current iteration that we are on, over -1. So basically that's what we are doing over here. Now let's run this code and see how it will run. So you see it worked flawlessly. Now let's try and submit this code. Actually, I've solved this problem before, so most of the times, yes, this is how this is what I mostly get, right? So when talking about, let's say, things like space complexity, the space complexity of this one is basically O of 1, right? The space complexity of this one is O of 1. So big O of 1, big O of 1, right? Big O of 1. Why are we saying that? Because basically, as the number of inputs increases, it does not increase the number of space that we are using. We are just assigning a variable over here, assigning a new variable over here, right? And we just maintain this throughout the application. Even if you have over 10,000 individual items in the array, we are still going to get only just 2 variable assignments over here. So basically, the space complexity of big O of 1. And also, since you are just running a basic for loop, right, the time complexity of this is basically big O of n, right? So as the number of input increases, the number of, or the times you run the for loop will increase, right? So basically, when the array is of size n, we need to run the algorithm for a time of n, or for an iteration of n times, right? So That's all for today. If you like this in-depth guide and how to solve this Leetcode problem, I would like for you to subscribe to my channel because there are more things that is coming, and see you guys very soon. Thank you very much.